The tiredness you feel didn't start last year. It didn't start when your job became demanding, or your relationships became complicated, or your life became whatever you've been blaming. If you trace it back honestly, following the thread of exhaustion through decades, you'll find it was already there in childhood, before you had words for it, before you understood that other people weren't carrying the same invisible weight. You came into consciousness already tired, not from what you were doing, but from what you were being required to be. And you've never rested since, because the requirement never ended. It just became invisible, incorporated so completely into your sense of self that you stopped recognizing it as burden. Something happened to you that you've never fully named. Somewhere in the fog of early memory, you learned that existing as yourself was not going to work, that the spontaneous creature you were, with its needs, its noise, its unfiltered expressions of want and fear and joy, was too much, or not enough, or wrong in some way that was never fully explained, but was communicated with absolute clarity through 1,000 small corrections, disappointments, withdrawals of love or attention. You learned to edit, to monitor, to perform a version of yourself that was acceptable in ways the original wasn't. And this performance, begun before you could possibly understand what you were sacrificing, has continued every day since. The tiredness you feel is the tiredness of performing yourself for decades without intermission. You've tried everything to fix the exhaustion, and nothing has worked for long. The supplements, the sleep optimization, the exercise routines, the meditation apps, the vacations that are supposed to restore you but somehow don't. And you've wondered if something is fundamentally wrong with you, if you're broken in some way that prevents you from having the energy that others seem to have. But you're not broken. You're carrying something they're not. You've been running a program since childhood that consumes enormous resources, and you've never questioned the program because you didn't know you were running it. The program was installed before you arrived at consciousness. By the time you could think about yourself, it was already there, already running, already exhausting you in ways you had no framework to understand. Carl Jung understood that the self is not a single thing, but a system, a complex arrangement of conscious and unconscious elements, some of which work together and some of which work against each other. The exhaustion that begins in childhood, he recognized, comes from this internal friction, from parts of the self that were exiled because they weren't welcome, from authentic impulses that had to be suppressed because they threatened survival, from the enormous energetic cost of maintaining a persona that doesn't match what's underneath. You're not tired from your life. You're tired from the gap between your life and yourself. The persona you developed in childhood was not a mistake. It was adaptation, survival. The child who refuses to adjust doesn't thrive. They suffer in ways that can be far worse than the suffering of adjustment. You did what you needed to do, but the adaptation was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to get you through childhood and then relax as you entered adult life with more control over your circumstances. Instead, something went wrong. The adaptation solidified. The persona fused. The performance that was supposed to be strategic became automatic, compulsive, invisible to you even as it drained you day after day, year after year, until the tiredness became so familiar you couldn't remember what it felt like to not be tired. Consider what you suppress on a daily basis without even noticing. The opinion you don't voice because it might create conflict. The need you don't express because it might be too much. The anger you don't feel because anger wasn't permitted in your original environment. The joy you don't fully experience because exuberance was somehow dangerous. Each suppression costs energy. Each monitoring takes resources. The constant vigilance required to maintain a self that's acceptable rather than authentic is exhausting in ways that don't show up in blood tests, that doctors can't diagnose, that everyone around you probably shares but won't talk about because the culture doesn't have language for this particular kind of tired. Jung would tell you that the path out of this exhaustion is not more management, but less. Not better performance, but the gradual dismantling of performance itself. This is shadow work, not confronting monsters, but reclaiming exiles. The parts of yourself you've been suppressing since childhood aren't enemies, they're refugees. They were sent away for safety reasons, and they've been waiting ever since to be allowed home. The anger that wasn't permitted contains energy you need. The spontaneity that wasn't safe contains aliveness you've been missing. The need that was too much contains information about what you actually require to thrive. This reclamation doesn't happen through insight alone. Understanding the mechanism doesn't automatically fix it. What's required is experience, the gradual, often uncomfortable process of letting suppressed parts surface and discovering that the danger you thought they posed was exaggerated. The child had reasons to fear, but you're not a child anymore. The environment that required suppression is probably no longer your environment. And yet the suppression continues because the psyche, having learned to protect itself this way, doesn't automatically update when circumstances change. It has to be shown through repeated experience that what was dangerous then is not dangerous now. The tiredness you've been carrying since childhood is not personal failure. It's the cost of survival in environments that required you to be less than whole. And the exhaustion has been trying to tell you something all these years, that the current arrangement isn't sustainable, that the self was never meant to perform indefinitely, that rest will remain impossible until you address what's actually depleting you. Not the job, not the relationships, not the circumstances of your adult life. The performance that began decades ago and has been running without pause ever since. Imagine what it would feel like to stop performing. Not all at once, that would be overwhelming, but gradually. To notice in the moment when you're suppressing and to ask whether suppression is still necessary. To let some of the exile parts surface in safe contexts and discover they're not as dangerous as you learn to believe. To experience, maybe for the first time, what it feels like to simply be yourself without the constant editing, monitoring, adjusting. This is not a small thing. It's a reorganization of everything. But it's also the only path to the rest you've been seeking your entire life. You've been tired since childhood because you've been working since childhood. Not work in the external sense, work in the internal sense. The labor of self-construction, self-suppression, self-performance. The labor of being what you needed to be rather than what you actually were. This labor was necessary once. It may not be necessary now. And discovering whether it's still necessary piece by piece is the work of reclaiming the energy that's been held hostage by a survival strategy that forgot it was supposed to be temporary. Jung didn't promise this would be easy. He promised it would be real. Real in a way that performance can never be. Real enough to finally deserve the rest you've been seeking for as long as you can remember.